In the night of November 13th, 1985, the Nevado del Ruiz volcano unleashed its deadliest fury. At 9:09 p.m., ice and rock collapsed under the heat of the eruption, melting vast sections of glacier in minutes. What followed was a torrent unlike anything survivable, a cascade of boiling mud, rock, and ash that accelerated down the valleys at highway speeds. Entire river channels were consumed, transformed into roaring walls of sludge carrying boulders the size of houses. By 10:30 p.m., the lahars had swollen into moving mountains, gathering forests, farmland, and structures into their flow. Witnesses in upstream villages described hearing an unearthly thunder, as if the ground itself were being dragged away. Yet, in the darkness and steady rain, the scale of the catastrophe remained invisible, until it was too late. At 11:30 p.m., the first surges reached Armero, a town of nearly 30,000. The impact was instantaneous. Mud and debris struck with the force of an avalanche, smashing through neighborhoods, swallowing entire blocks within seconds. Homes lifted from their foundations and disintegrated, vehicles vanished into the churning mass, and streets were erased as if they had never existed. For those inside, there was little chance to react. Families were pinned where they slept, buried alive as ceilings gave way and the slurry pressed down like wet cement. People trying to flee were engulfed mid-stride, pulled under as collapsing walls and rooftops closed in around them. Others clung desperately to trees or fragments of rooftops, only to be swept away by the roaring current. The sound of destruction mixed with human voices, screams rising, then cut short as the town disappeared beneath the mud. Within minutes, Armero's cries were reduced to muffled echoes beneath the surface. Entire neighborhoods were entombed in layers of ash and slurry, the weight sealing doors and trapping vehicles as though the earth itself had folded over them. By midnight, Armero had ceased to exist in recognizable form, its buildings flattened, its people buried, its very outline erased from the map. The eruption itself had lasted only moments, but its legacy was a lahar that annihilated an entire town in the span of a single hour. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, Colombia's Red Cross and civil defense units attempted to mobilize from neighboring towns. The scale of destruction made travel into Armero nearly impossible. Roadways had either been washed out or buried, leaving vehicles immobile and forcing rescuers to proceed on foot through unstable ground. Radio communication broke down repeatedly, preventing coordination between scattered teams. Helicopters began arriving at first light, but visibility was reduced by lingering ash clouds that clung to the valleys. Strong updrafts from the warm mud and uneven terrain forced pilots to hover at higher altitudes, limiting the number of survivors they could reach. Ground crews attempting to meet them were slowed by mud that was chest-deep in certain areas, with debris piles concealing bodies beneath hardened crusts. Efforts to evacuate those still alive turned chaotic. Many victims trapped in the slurry had only their heads or arms visible above the surface, requiring painstaking work to free them. Tools sank into the mud or broke under strain, and heavy machinery could not be moved into position. Hours were lost extracting single individuals, while others nearby disappeared beneath rising layers of sludge and dirty water. Medical assistance was severely strained. Improvised field posts treated fractures, hypothermia, and infections, but supplies of antibiotics and clean water deteriorated quickly. Stretchers and bandages were reused repeatedly, and doctors operated under lantern light. Many patients required amputations to prevent gangrene, but surgical equipment was unavailable for several days. International aid convoys from the United Nations and several countries began arriving later in the week. The remote locations slowed their entry, with bridges collapsed and airstrips rendered unusable by thick mud. Relief flights had to circle until temporary landing zones were cleared. Entire trucks of food and blankets sat idle until secondary routes could be opened. Government handling added further obstacles. Initial broadcasts minimized the scale of the destruction, leading to delays in mobilizing external help. Bureaucratic approval slowed the release of emergency funds, with official tallies of casualties and damage withheld, until pressure mounted from journalists and foreign observers. This withholding of information meant badly needed supplies and personnel arrived days after the first critical period had already passed. By the end of the first week, most rescue operations had shifted from searching for survivors to recovering bodies. Teams continued working in mud that hardened with each day, forcing them to use hand tools and even bare hands to move debris. The initial challenges of response had defined the outcome. Despite extraordinary effort by those on the ground, large portions of the population had no chance of being reached in time. At about 11:35 p.m., the largest surge of debris reached central Armero. By then, the flow measured several meters deep and moved with the full weight of saturated volcanic material. Entire sections of the town were engulfed in minutes, with most structures unable to withstand the sudden burial. Streets and open spaces were consumed so quickly that thousands of residents had no opportunity to evacuate. In some districts, the mud rose to a depth of 5 meters, leaving only roofs and church bell towers visible. Houses filled instantly, collapsing from pressure or vanishing beneath waves of sediment. Families gathered inside were caught without warning, their bodies immobilized as walls fell around them. Survivors later confirmed that escape routes disappeared in seconds, as doorways and passageways clogged with a heavy slurry. The force of the lahar swept away not only homes but also public buildings. Schools, markets, and community halls were destroyed without leaving identifiable remains. Churches with strong masonry walls were toppled, their occupants crushed as roofs collapsed under the weight. Vehicles were rolled into heaps and submerged, with entire buses recorded as missing. Casualty counts rose at an unprecedented rate. Roughly 23,000 people died in Armero that night, the majority smothered within minutes of impact. Those not killed by the initial wave often succumbed to suffocation or drowning as the slurry solidified. Many of the victims were children, struck as they slept in their beds during school term time. Isolated survivors reported being trapped in heavy mud that reached their necks, unable to free their limbs. One case that received international attention was that of 13-year-old Omaira Sanchez, who remained pinned by wreckage for nearly 3 days before dying in full view of television crews. The image became a defining marker of the human cost, conveying the scale of suffering faced by those still alive after the first hours. Rural settlements along the Lagunilla River also suffered catastrophic losses. Villages closer to the mountain, constructed in narrow valleys, were destroyed by earlier waves before Armero was hit. Their populations had even fewer chances of survival, with entire communities eradicated in silence during the night. Documentation of their existence often disappeared with the people themselves, leaving little trace beyond survivor testimony. By dawn on November 14th, Armero was reduced to a flat expanse of mud and fragments. What had been a town of nearly 29,000 residents was now a wasteland, with only scattered survivors calling out for help. The scale of the fatalities became clear only as rescue teams counted thousands of bodies exposed on the hardened surface, with tens of thousands more buried below, unreachable beneath the settled flow. In the hours following the destruction of Armero, new mud flows continued to descend from Nevado del Ruiz through the night and into the following day. These secondary lahars, smaller but still highly destructive, reached other communities downstream. Towns such as Chinchina and Mariquita were inundated as new channels of slurry formed in tributaries already swollen with volcanic debris. Tens of thousands of people were displaced as homes, farmland, and basic infrastructure were absorbed. The disaster was no longer limited to one town, but began impacting a wide region across several valleys. Rivers across the Magdalena watershed became clogged with silt, boulders, and uprooted trees carried down by the flows. This obstruction reduced capacity, leading to localized flooding miles from the eruption site. Stagnant pools formed behind blocked channels, contaminating water supplies for communities dependent on river access. Within weeks, reports of waterborne disease appeared, including outbreaks of cholera and dysentery among displaced residents forced to use untreated sources for drinking and washing. Rescue operations, already strained, became increasingly disorderly. As supplies moved slowly and communications faltered, looters entered abandoned settlements in search of valuables, complicating the efforts of security forces and diverting them from relief coordination. The breakdown of order created further risks for survivors, many of whom had lost access to food, shelter, and medical care. Air travel was also disrupted across Colombia. Ash plumes interfered with flight paths, grounding or diverting aircraft that might otherwise have delivered personnel and supplies. Radio and telephone services suffered repeated outages from ash accumulation and damaged lines. The inability to communicate between isolated villages meant urgent situations often went unreported until much later. The broader national context added further complications. Colombia was in the midst of a prolonged civil conflict, with government forces, insurgent groups, and paramilitaries engaged in fighting across multiple regions. This draw on state resources reduced the cohesion of the relief effort. Military units assigned to disaster zones were sometimes redeployed, leaving gaps in both search operations and distribution of aid. Weeks later, the environmental consequences of the eruption extended the crisis. Saturated soils eroded from farmlands, leaving fields barren and prone to collapse. Agricultural losses devastated livelihoods in rural areas where crops had been the only source of income. Families who survived the initial destruction faced an economic collapse that forced many to relocate permanently. The eruption's aftermath did not resolve quickly. What began as a single night of catastrophic mud flows evolved into prolonged instability, marked by health crises, food shortages, rural displacement, and long-term environmental damage. The disaster's escalation ensured that its effects were felt across Colombia, far beyond the initial destruction of Armero. Nevado del Ruiz, located in Colombia's central Andes, rises more than 5,300 meters above sea level. Its peak has long been covered in thick glaciers that extend down its flanks. The region around the mountain has been inhabited for centuries, with small towns and farmland established on the fertile soils created by earlier volcanic activity. Records confirm that Ruiz produced lethal lahars in 1595 and again in 1845, incidents that destroyed communities along its river valleys. By the mid-19th century, despite these historic eruptions, population centers grew across the lower plains. Armero was established in the 1890s, chosen for its fertile surroundings and access to rivers. Over the decades, its prosperity in cotton and rice production encouraged expansion even into zones that lay directly along lahar channels. The risks of the surrounding terrain remained part of geological archives, but were not accounted for in planning decisions. Renewed seismic unrest began in late 1984. Tremors were recorded near the volcano's summit, and fumaroles released high levels of sulfur gases. Colombian scientists monitoring these signs presented their findings to government officials, identifying that magma was rising. Their warnings indicated that any eruption, however small, could destabilize the ice sheets that covered the summit. A minor eruption occurred on September 11, 1985. Ash columns rose above the peak and dusted neighboring towns. Authorities ordered partial evacuations, but when no deadly flow followed, the measures were reversed within days. Some residents later refused to evacuate at future warnings, citing the false alarm as evidence that the danger had been overstated. In October, Colombian geologists and international experts issued detailed hazard assessments. They highlighted the high probability of lahars triggered by relatively modest eruptions. Using satellite imagery and topographical surveys, the US Geological Survey and Colombian institutions mapped likely flow paths. These maps accurately traced channels moving directly toward Armero and other towns. The hazard maps were published, but distribution failed. Many copies remained in offices, and those passed to local authorities did not circulate widely among residents. Reports of skepticism from municipal leaders compounded the problem, as they questioned the reliability of predictions. Without broad dissemination, evacuation planning never progressed beyond early discussions. By November 1985, the volcano continued to release gases and seismic events persisted. Scientists repeated their assessments, but officials delayed issuing new orders. The warnings emphasized that even a moderate eruption could unleash destructive flows across populated valleys. Despite these alerts, no comprehensive effort was made to remove populations from the threatened areas. When Nevado del Ruiz erupted on November 13th, the precise conditions described in prior warnings unfolded. The collapse of summit glaciers released catastrophic lahars, following the exact channels anticipated in the hazard maps. The failure to act upon those earlier reports was later cited as a primary factor in the scale of the disaster. The catastrophe of November 1985 was not caused by volcanic activity alone. Geological conditions had long been recognized. Nevado del Ruiz stood with a large ice cap that could generate destructive flows when melted by even moderate eruptions. The interaction of hot material with steep glacial surfaces was a predictable trigger for lahars. Historical records documented this outcome centuries earlier, and hazard studies in the months before accurately projected similar scenarios. Despite this, state priorities leaned heavily toward minimizing the perceived threat. Colombia at the time was under significant fiscal pressure, with deep economic strain shaping decisions at every administrative level. Evacuations on the scale required for Armero and surrounding towns carried costs the government was unwilling to commit. Without absolute certainty, the choice to delay measures was weighed against budgets rather than immediacy of geological evidence. Monitoring systems available to scientists were limited. Instruments capable of real-time observation and communication of volcanic change were either underfunded or not installed. Local teams had no access to continuous seismographs or automated lahar detection networks. This absence of reliable data created gaps in interpretation, leaving warnings to be issued conservatively, even when early indicators suggested imminent danger. Bureaucratic processes further interfered with preparation. Hazard maps created through joint work of national geologists and international agencies were released in October 1985, but implementation stalled. Municipal leaders faced disputes over land zoning, relocation policies, and the impact of acknowledging risk on property values. These delays meant maps never translated into evacuation drills or enforcement, even as the eruption date drew closer. Throughout the late 1980s, international media coverage ensured that suppressed findings gradually became public. Declassified reports outlined systemic failures in communication, land use planning, and emergency readiness. These documents demonstrated that specific measures, such as evacuation drills, reinforced structures, and resource stockpiles, had been recommended but not implemented. The release of these details fueled growing distrust in official institutions. What developed after the eruption was not only a humanitarian crisis, but also a prolonged struggle over accountability. The survivors of Armero and surrounding towns lived with injuries, chronic illness, and permanent displacement. Alongside the physical recovery efforts, the investigations exposed weaknesses in governance and infrastructure that had amplified the impact of the natural disaster. In 1989, Colombia implemented the National System for Disaster Prevention, a framework created as a direct response to the failures revealed by the Nevado del Ruiz eruption. The system centralized coordination between geological institutes, civil defense, and local administrations. It also expanded funding for volcanic monitoring stations across the Andean region, ensuring continuous seismic and lahar detection for at-risk communities. The lessons from Armero influenced policy well beyond Colombia. International agencies emphasized the importance of integrating scientific warnings directly into emergency law, removing delays caused by political hesitation. By the early 1990s, the United Nations had launched the Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction, a global initiative shaped in part by the recognized failures that amplified the Colombian tragedy. In volcanology, Armero became a reference point for hazard planning. Protocols for lahar risk were revised worldwide, leading to the installation of early warning systems in countries with ice-covered volcanoes. Sirens, automated alerts, and permanent evacuation routes were established in previously unprotected valleys, reducing the likelihood of similar mass casualties. The site of Armero itself remains uninhabited, preserved as a cautionary landscape. Memorials mark the former town's boundaries, with plaques and monuments listing the tens of thousands who died. Visitors encounter remnants of structures protruding from hardened mud, maintained as a stark record of what occurred and as evidence of the dangers of ignoring documented risks. The legacy of Nevado del Ruiz is therefore defined not only by loss, but also by the systemic changes it forced. Scientific accuracy was no longer treated as optional in policymaking, and the event became a case study in the cost of disregarding hazard assessments. Yet beyond policy and science, the memory of Armero endures in tribute to its people, families and communities whose lives were cut short, but whose story continues to remind the world of both the fragility and resilience of human life in the face of nature's power. For more fascinating horror, hit the like button and subscribe.